Hi, everybody. We are here with Dr. Kimberly Nix Berens, and this is a very exciting day. I'm thrilled to be chatting with you today. But today is your happy book launch day.
Yes,
Congratulations. Blind Spots is now available. It's Dr. Kim's highly anticipated first book, Why Students Fail and the Science That Can Save Them. And you can get your book. I already have one, and it's not but today on Amazon and on Barnes and Noble. That's so exciting. Congratulations, Dr. Kim.
Thank you so much. I know it's hard to believe. You work and work and work, and then all of a sudden the day arrives, and it's almost an out of body experience. So
I'm sure.
I'm thrilled to be talking to you about it today.
Yes, I'm thrilled to talk to you as well. And here at Long Island Press, we're thrilled to be able to break the news of your book launch. Because you really are inspiring to me and so many parents and so many children. You know, I'm a huge fan of you, your work with children and your really tireless advocacy and passion for education. So I'm just going to brag about you for a second, if you don't mind. So for all of you that are joining us, I want you to know that Dr. Kimberly Nix Berens is a scientist educator. So what that means, that's very unique and meaningful term.
Well, we kind of invented that term, so yes.
Right, but it's meaningful. You know, she's not just a researcher, which is a valuable piece of this, but she's also a teacher. She spends, hours with students on a weekly basis. So it's not about ivory tower research.
Right.
It's really about getting into the trenches with the kids and seeing what works and seeing what doesn't work. She's a founder of Fit Learning. She co-created this powerful system of instruction, which is based on behavioral science and the technology of teaching. And she's seen it transform the learning abilities of thousands of children worldwide. And, it ranges from whether a child is struggling, average, disabled, or gifted. And for more than 20 years, her system of instruction has produced, ready for this, 1 year's worth of academic growth in only 40 hours of training, which is incredible. And it really goes to show you what science can make such a big difference. Her programs effectively target essential areas like learning skills, basic classroom readiness, phonemic awareness, reading fluency, comprehension, inferential language, basic and advanced mathematics, logical problem solving, grammar, and expressive writing. Believe it or not, her early beginnings started in a broom closet at the University of Nevada in Reno. And Dr. Berens has helped to grow locations worldwide, in more than 30 locations, which is amazing. She's a frequent, obviously not surprising, she's a frequent invited speaker, and she's a regular contributor to many popular press publications such as Thrive Global, 74 Million, New York Family, and Medium, and we're thrilled to have her at the Long Island Press Facebook Live. So tell me, Dr. Berens, why did you write Blind Spots?
Right. Wow. Like that's the $1 million question. Well, I'll tell you, again, as you so graciously, your gracious introduction, and again, thank you so much for having me today. I'm so thrilled to be here. I have been tirelessly working in this area for a long time. I actually even started before my doctoral training at the University of Nevada. I started in undergrad. I just got lucky. I mean, I met a woman, a behavioral scientist, as an undergraduate my freshman year, who changed my life, because I had blind spots at that time. I grew up with a psychiatrist father, and I came from the medical, most of my family is really in the medical field. And so I saw the world in a very specific way. And I met Maria Ruiz, who was my undergraduate mentor, and she really created distinctions for me about how behavior, is a different subject matter, and how learning actually happens from a scientific perspective. And I had never had the opportunity to see the world in that way. And when I realized that there was actually a science to why we behave the way we do, and that there's actually a science to how, we learn as human beings, it blew my mind. And so I started working I got in the trenches right away, working with adults with disabilities and then helping, start a preschool for children with autism. Because I'll be honest with you, behavioral science is very well known in the area of treatment for disabilities. It's, our field, applied behavior analysis, is the #1 treatment for children with autism and related disabilities. And so it's like the culture totally gets that the science of behavior applies when kids really struggle to learn, right? But somehow there's been a bigger resistance to the fact that the science of learning should apply anytime learning is involved. But that's not what's happened. So mainstream education, or the education of a majority of school children who don't have, some kind of neurological disability that's extremely, obvious and impacting them in a significant way. Our field is nowhere to be found. So this, behavioral science is the science of learning, which again, sadly, not many people actually know that. It is highly relevant to any type of learning you're talking about. So the fact that teachers aren't trained in behavioral science is not a part of colleges of education unless you have it inside of a special education program in a college of education, which is really geared towards children with autism. It's not part of mainstream teacher training programs. And so teachers aren't trained in the science behind how the learning process actually works. And we have a century of science now that suggests that, and we've made a lot of discoveries about how we've evolved to learn, and that science should be applied to how teachers are trained to teach, but it isn't. And so I've, tirelessly devoted my career to accelerating academic achievement with every type of learner. And I've had countless conversations with parents who have been sold down the river about why their children are struggling, that they have some phantom learning disability, that they are, they're just not capable, or their brains aren't wired for math, or their brains aren't wired for reading, or their brains aren't wired for writing. They've been told these fantasies which is, from someone who's been trained the way I have, it shocks me that anyone believes it, but everyone does. So people literally believe things about learning that are absolute myths, that are not correct, but that dominate how teachers are trained to teach and how our schools are designed. And as a result, a majority of children are below proficiency in academic subjects in the United States, and it's not getting better, it's only getting worse. And now we're in a pandemic, and the pressure on our educational system is even more severe, and we are in big trouble. So I wrote the book because I'd had enough. I'd had enough of having to have the same conversation with another parent, having to witness another child who has been tragically failed, and not because of anything wrong with that child, but because the way schools are designed and the way teachers are trained to teach fundamentally doesn't work. And it doesn't work because it's not based on the science behind the learning process. And that is shocking. And it is 2020, and it is time for our schools to evolve. So that's why I wrote the book.
Well, thank God, because it is devastating. And, another thing I wanted to say about it, whenever you say it to me, like, my heart hurts because, yes, our children get behind in education, and we can put Band-Aids on it, which I think is a lot of what happens. But there's a lot of emotional damage done because, these labels on our children, I mean, yes, as a parent, it's devastating to hear, but as a child, it's overwhelming to hear. Right. And I think, it gets in the way of them developing and having confidence and being able to overcome difficulties because they believe that about themselves.
Yes.
So, to me, that's, also just such a huge, huge problem in the way that our children are failed and are labeled. Absolutely. So, the crisis, obviously, you really outline it great in Blind Spots, talking about the crisis that's happening. But why, since it doesn't work, why doesn't it change?
Right.
I mean,
right. Yes.
Simple
So
question.
that's another $1 million question. So I'll tell you this, the first large scale study, and this is all in my book, but the first large scale study of educational outcomes for United States schools was conducted over an 8-year period from 1940 to 1948. And the results of that study indicated that a majority of American students were below proficiency in all academic subjects, because it was the first time there were actually academic achievement tests developed to test outcomes. And since that initial study, every other one that's ever been done has produced the same outcomes. Has the same results have been produced, meaning not once in the history of our educational system have a majority of children performed at proficiency or better, and not once has a large number of children performed at the advanced level. So our educational system has been mediocratizing and failing American students for close to a century. And it's not as if people haven't tried to do stuff. Reform efforts are continually tried, but what's never been done throughout the history of educational reform is the modification of teacher training programs and the modification of teaching practices. That has never been done. There's only one large scale study called Project Follow Through where that was ever done, where it was a study on educational methods. And there were like 25 methods included in that study, most of which stemmed from progressive education, which is the dominant perspective, which is the dominant ideology of our educational system. And then 2 were based in behavioral science. And that study was overwhelmingly clear that the 2 methods based in behavioral science outperformed all other methods, not only by multiple standard deviations with respect to academic achievement, but also on measures of self-esteem. And that study, which was Project Follow Through, which occurred over a 10-year period from like 1968 to 1978, that study was a classic example of the dangers of ideology in an institution that should come from pragmatic values. And so those are 2 big words. And so let me tell you what I mean. So education is an ideological institution. And what that means, it's a belief-based system. So it's based on beliefs.
Currently it is. Our American educational system is.
And around the globe, educational systems are. So it's not unique to the United States. Now,
Okay.
I mainly wrote my book about the crisis in American education because I am, in fact, an American. But this is a global crisis. So education is a notoriously ideological institution, meaning it was designed based on beliefs about what education could do for our democracy, about what education means, what the goals of education should be, what kids should be taught. But all of that came from an ideological place, meaning ideas, right? And look, there's nothing wrong with ideas, right? I mean, like our whole country was founded on ideas. But the problem is when ideas become the litmus test, or beliefs become the litmus test without evaluating, the effectiveness of those ideas. And without looking at like, what are our goals? Like if our goals, and this is what pragmatism gives you, is that if our goals are the effective education of a majority of children and the effective, the ability to produce high levels of advanced performers in the United States, like if that's our goal, then we need to come from pragmatism. And that means we have to use science. So we have to approach our educational system from a scientific perspective where we are testing practices and evaluating the effectiveness of those practices and evolving based on discarding the ineffective practices and improving and revising the effective ones. In other words, we need to go after our errors. We need to go after where we're failing and learn from those errors through the process of science, which is what science does. Mm-hmm. In a belief-based system, that's not what happens at all. In a belief-based system, what you do is you pick and choose evidence, or you search for evidence that confirms your beliefs, and then you discount anything that contradicts your beliefs. And the litmus test in a belief-based system is, do the practices match what we believe those practices should be, rather than do the practices produce the outcomes we want to achieve? And those are 2 very different perspectives. And because education has always been ideological and never scientific, it's never evolved. because evolution stems from science. It's the only possibility for us. Otherwise, we're in a vicious cycle of arguing about opinions, which is where we find ourselves in the greater culture in a lot of areas right now, rather than identifying what are our goals and then implementing the scientific method to evaluate how best to accomplish those goals. Those are two very different things. And so because education's never been a pragmatic institution, we've never done that. And so that's what happened with the Project Follow-Through study, is that all those results about the behavioral methods were pushed to the side. And what happened was they hired all different kinds of data analysis companies to try to reanalyze the results and see if they could have progressive education models come out better. And when they didn't, what the stakeholders did was convince Congress to stop funding the effective behaviorally based methods and throw all the money at the methods that reflected the beliefs of the educational establishment, but were ineffective. And their thinking was, well, this is the way we believe kids should learn, so let's just throw a lot of money at it and see if we can make it better. Well, that was in the 1970s, and it didn't work because we have made no progress. Although there have been small, modest gains in some math skills over time, there's been never gains in reading. None of those gains have produced a majority of kids at the proficient level. So it did not work. But again, because the educational establishment clings to their beliefs as the fundamental thing they care about, those outcomes don't matter. Because what matters is that they are on a mission to prove themselves right every day about how our beliefs are correct. And
without looking at the children and without looking at the results.
Outcomes.
You know, who knew that blind spots was going to be such a perfect time now? Because it's really, this is what we're talking about in our culture is, are we going to listen to science and save ourselves, right? Or are we going to cling to our beliefs that are not accurate, that are not going to produce the results that we're looking for? So, you know, Blind Spots is really the perfect book, and you can get it on Amazon, you can get it on Barnes and Noble, you know, to talk about education under this science time. And it's really a perfect time to start talking about it because it is forefront in our culture. So tell me some of the secrets that behavioral science uncovers.
Yes. Well, and what's hilarious is that I find it shocking that I'm considered controversial, right? Like, you know, now that my book's out, I will tell you, I had a hard time sleeping last night because my book's is out in the world today. And I call into question a lot of very widely held notions about learning. And it's not just widely held notions by the public. It's widely held notions by members of the psychological establishment, the medical establishment, and the educational establishment. And, you know, those widely held notions are myths. So I'm basically, you know, calling into question a lot of things that are just almost like second nature, like the notion of learning styles and that a kid's personality somehow impacts how they learn. And the notion of, you know, that the way a child physically develops over time is linked to when they learn things. You know, that's just two of the common beliefs that age determines if kids master skills or not.
So the myths, really, these are some of the myths that are education. And that's something that really blew me away, that what you said is that, you know, we assume our children develop in their minds and educationally the same way they do with their height and their foot size, and how wrong that is. I mean, you know, it's something that we must accept it as what it is, and that we're always measuring our children against, right? I mean, from the time they're born, we're measuring them against other children of that age.
Of course you are.
And you know, it shows here how that's, you know, how that's a myth is a wow.
And so when you asked me about the discoveries of behavioral science, you know, the most profound discovery is that we learn through the repeated reinforcement of our behavior over time. And that is a scientific fact. And it stems from the way we evolved as a species. You know, it benefits us that when we behave in our environment and our behavior comes into contact with a reinforcing consequence, it's that reinforcing consequence that makes it more likely that we're going to learn that behavior. So our evolution has led us to have a neurological capacity to learn from our individual environments. So for instance, like, I write about it in my book, but it starts in infancy. So like when infants are born, you'll notice that infants are constantly moving, right? And that's one of the issues with kids who are born with disabilities is they may not do that as much. But, kids who are born, neurotypically are constantly behaving. They're moving their arms, their legs, they're moving their heads around, they're moving their eyes around. There's a reason we are born moving, and that's all reflexive. It's not like learned. But because we are moving, that movement makes it likely that we are going to accidentally come into contact with something in the environment that we can learn from. And that something in the environment is a consequence. So like I write in my book about an infant lying in their crib with a mobile above their crib that's within their reach. So the infant's moving, because all infants do, that's evolutionarily selected for us. So an infant's moving and then accidentally their arm hits that mobile. Well, movement in a visual field, we have evolved to have that be reinforcing because that benefits us. It benefits our survival. It benefits a lot of things. So movement in the visual field is powerfully reinforcing. And so what has just happened when that infant has accidentally hit that mobile is that has been a consequence. That's a reinforcer. And that if that infant is in that crib, in that situation, time and time again, they are likely going to learn that response. So rather than it being reflexive and random, it has become learned. And even though it looks like, oh, my child's intentionally moving the mobile, no, it's not like they're lying there saying, I'm going to make that mobile move. That's absurd. What's happening is that response has been selected by the environment because of repeated reinforcement. And that happens the moment children are born. And so what this also tells you is how unique a child's environment is, because you might have twins lying side by side in two cribs, and one mobile just happens to be a fraction lower than the other kid's mobile, right? And because that twin with the lower mobile had the opportunity to have that response reinforced, they had the opportunity to learn how to move their arm to make a mobile move, and the other infant didn't. And they're identical twins. That in that exact moment, they have a different learning history. Wow. And that's the precision with which environments select and shape behavioral repertoires is profoundly misunderstood. That's why everyone's like gene studies, like, oh, these identical twins are exactly the same. No, they're not. They're never going to be exactly the same, because they could be in the same room within 5 inches of each other and have a different experience. Because it's that selecting feature of the environment, which is why when we're talking about children in poverty, when we're talking about children in impoverished learning environments, that is what explains those differences. Now, look, does socioeconomic, those big macro, variables matter? Of course it does. But at the level of selection, at the level of that precise, like when an environment is actually shaping a child's repertoire, that has to be understood at a more precise level. So there's reasons why kids in poverty who come from impoverished environments don't perform as well, because they don't have the same kind of enrichment in their lives, because they don't have access to all the different kinds of toys necessarily, or their parents are working 4 jobs. And so they don't have as much interaction with another human being. And their parents may not speak English or may not be educated themselves. All of those moments reflect learning opportunities. I mean, the minute a child is born, they are now in a learning environment. And that learning environment is unique and it is individualized. And sometimes those learning environments are not well designed. And that is what happens in schools, because learning environments are not designed through the understanding of behavior occurs. I mean, learning occurs when behavior is repeatedly reinforced. So if kids aren't getting the opportunity to repeatedly practice skills, and if they're not having the opportunity to have those repeated practices reinforced, they're never going to permanently learn that. They're never going to permanently learn those things. We don't learn via exposure. We don't learn via osmosis, by showing kids stuff. That's not how we learn. We have to behave with respect to that subject matter repeatedly and have that behavior reinforced for learning to happen. And schools, that's nowhere to be found. I mean, maybe kind of, but it's like kind of. It's not a true understanding and intentional design of schools with that.
It may happen, but it's really on accident almost.
It's on accident.
To on purpose.
Well, and that's the thing. So sure, do some kids make it through school? Sure they do. Of course, because guess why? We have evolved as humans with a very good capacity to learn from our environments. Like, we're set up that way. So of course, Some kids make it through school fine because their learning histories have selected the kind of behavioral repertoires that have enabled that to be the case. But the tragic problem is that schools point to those lucky few kids and say, see, our educational system works. Look at that kid and look at that kid and look at that kid, rather than saying, what about the 90% of children of color who are below proficiency in math and science? And that is the current statistic.
Well,
90%.
I think even the kids that are seen to be doing well, I can say from my own experience, my daughter does well. She's in 4th grade. She's always gotten great, response from the teachers. She's reading above, but at the end of the day, she's missing a ton of basic skills that are going to trip her up. Yep. And really, she's not at the proficiency level. So it's not even only, the children that are, the 90% of, colored children and children that are impoverished, yep. But it's also, children that are in good schools that are rated very high that are doing okay. They're not failing and they're not superstars, but they're lost.
Yeah. It's the
so what other myths? These are fascinating to me.
Right.
Can you share a couple other myths that are in the education system?
Yes. Well, I mean, my favorite myth is they're just not ready yet. So, and I write about this in my book, and this is a classic statement made by educators to parents of young children, usually in kindergarten or 1st grade, who have failed to adequately acquire academic skills. And the statement is, oh, sure, they're struggling with reading, but they're just not ready to read. They'll read when they're ready. As if reading is a part of our DNA that develops over time, like our height. And it's absurd. That the absurdity of the notion that academic skills are inherited traits, and it's so funny, like when I say these things out loud, I can't believe it that I'm actually having to say this, but reading is not inherited and math is not inherited. Those were human inventions. Those were inventions to help organize our world and develop our civilization. So human beings invented this stuff. I mean, if it was part of our DNA, then you could put it, there would be no difference between impoverished learners and neurotypical learners, because as soon as they get a certain age, they all start reading. It's ridiculous. You don't start reading until you've been effectively trained to read. And you don't start doing math until you've been effectively trained in mathematics. I mean, these are human inventions passed down via instruction. So the notion that a child who is just immature or is developing more slowly than another child is going to eventually start to read once their development catches up is tragic, because what happens is they get pushed on to the next grade level, already, not reading and already struggling. Guess what? That next year is not going to help them because it's a moving target, because now they're expected to do even more complicated skills, and they didn't have the component skills required in the first place to even do more simple things. So kids don't grow into reading skills. They don't grow into math skills. They have to develop those skills via training. We would never say, and this is why it drives me, I literally sometimes feel like I'm taking crazy pills, because I'm like, would you ever say, with my child isn't suddenly magically playing tennis well, that, oh, they're just, they just haven't developed that tennis gene yet. And they, over time, once they get a certain age, they'll really start being able to play tennis. We would never say that. Right. We know that tennis is a function of coaching and training and practice. The same thing with, you'd never expect a kid, oh, when they turn 7, they'll just be able to pick up that guitar and start really playing well. No, they have to be trained in that, and they have to practice. They have to practice the component skills. The educational establishment has done such a brilliant job of selling the progressive ideology that kids learn by discovering their worlds and by being exposed to experiences, and teachers don't have to directly instruct anything. They just have to be gentle guides. It's all a bunch of malarkey, because I sound like Joe Biden. I'm sorry, because it's ridiculous, because that's not how anyone learns anything. That's not how it works. And we have plenty of evidence, not only from other fields like music and sports, we have it from the educational field, whereas it's never worked. Like, when are we going to say to ourselves, maybe this isn't working? 80 years of educational failure, is that not enough to say, maybe this isn't how learning works? And guess what? It isn't, because there's an entire science that has discovered that nothing that happens in education has anything to do with how the learning process actually happens. It makes you want to gouge out your eyeballs.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So what do we need to do so our children can excel? As I said, it's again, I feel like it's not just academics. It's, when children fail in school, they feel like they're failures in life, and it affects their self-esteem and how they see themselves forever.
I mean,
so
it's not
what do we do?
And just to capitalize on that, it's not a coincidence that, kids have behavior problems in schools. There's a lot of violence in schools.
Mm-hmm.
Kids skip school. There's truancy. There's avoidance of school. There are fights in school. There are a lot of nasty things that happen in schools, especially in low-income, poor schools. And that is not a coincidence. And it has nothing to do with those being bad kids. And those being, they're just born bad. They're just bad kids. They're lazy. They're unmotivated. They don't have good morals. No, that is a function of their environment, meaning their environment is unbelievably aversive. And what do we do when we're faced? I mean, this is a part of our DNA as well. I mean, this is part of our evolution. When we're faced with an aversive or scary, fear-producing stimulus, we fight or we flee. Those are the two responses we engage in. And so do all animals. So we either defend ourselves or we bail. That's exactly what kids do. Kids either defend themselves by getting into trouble and talking out in class and having a bad attitude and getting into fights with the teacher or getting into fights with their peers, or they bail. They skip school, they go to sleep in class, they don't care, they stop trying, or more tragically, they implode on themselves, which is where I've seen so many of my kids that I've worked with over the years completely withdraw. They stop engaging at all. And it's called learned helplessness. I mean, this is a fundamental principle in psychology. When you are under repeated punishment, you stop even attempting to do anything. So with repeated punishment, you stop trying to fight and you stop trying to flee. You just lay there and let them shock you, which is what those dogs did in the classic learned helplessness study. So that's what a lot of kids do. They just give up. And it is a tragedy, because guess what? That's who they're going to be when they're 20. That's who they're going to be when they're 30. That's who they're going to be when they're 50. I can't tell you how many friends I have that know what I do and say to me, I've been a poor reader my whole life. I've never been a good reader. Or I can never spell. That's why I never send emails. I mean, these are debilitating deficits that don't go away. And that become I'm just bad at math. No one is just bad at math, because math is not genetically determined. If you're bad at math, then you had bad math instruction and you had no opportunity to have good practice. We got to get rid of
a whole different way of thinking about it.
The belief systems around this being a personality or inherent characteristic of a person is so dangerous, because number one, it lets people take credit. I mean, we want the credit. We want people to I'm not talented. I got a PhD and started this company and wrote a book. And guess what? None of that came from talent. That came from I had a mother who trained me how to work hard. I got lucky. I was one of the lucky ones that got through school okay. I was failed in math and I had to teach that to myself as an adult. But I had some amazing mentors. I am well trained. And I think we need to get away from attributing successes to inherent characteristics of people, because you know what that means? That means we're going to attribute failures to inherent characteristics of people. And that's what we do. And when we do that, it totally absolves anyone from taking responsibility for those failures. It makes the environment irrelevant. It leaves the teaching practices unexamined, and it leads to the institutionalization of what has happened in our country, which is prolonged systemic educational failure that we can now blame on learning disabilities, genetic characteristics of kids, personality, temperament, IQ.
I think it's exciting. What you're saying is exciting.
It is so exciting. It's take responsibility. Yeah.
It really shows that there's limitless possibility for every single child.
Yes.
And nobody is held back because of who they are or where they come from, that everybody has the same ability to be able to excel.
Yes.
So can you give us a couple of solutions? What can we do?
Well,
Um,
here's the thing. I mean, there's so many different angles on this. Like, first and foremost, the educational establishment is intractable, and that has been demonstrated to be the case for a century. It is an intractable institution. And so the pressure to evolve is going to have to come from the outside. It's going to have to come from citizens. And look, when I say the educational establishment, I don't even mean teachers. I mean, I mean the people in charge. I mean the administrators and the policymakers and a lot of people in the College of Education. You know, when I say that, that's who I'm talking about. I mean, even teachers are victim. I mean, they are tragic victims of this. Like, I am absolutely pro teacher. Teachers are the greatest humanitarians on earth. They devote their lives to making a difference, and they are failed in their training. And so they are expected to go out and use talent and theories and opinions and ideas to properly educate our nation's youth. It's absurd. So people need to get mad. I mean, that's my first thing is parents need to get angry and teachers need to get angry. Because when that happens, then grassroots movements happen. And there needs to be a grassroots, and look, I do the work. I'm doing the applied science. I'm writing the books. I can also start a movement in education. Like, that movement has to come, and I'm happy to be a representative of the movement. I'm happy to be a face of the movement. I'm happy to provide all the data and evidence the movement needs. But parents need to start a movement, and the movement needs to be science-based education in America. And it needs to be a national standard of educational practice. And we need to depoliticize the educational system. Now, I'm not saying that the educational system should not be a government institution. Yes, it should be, because it is a right of every American. Every American has the right to an effective education, and that right should be provided by all of us through our taxes and our government. But the administration of education is different than the practice of it. And the practice of it should be guided by teachers who are properly trained, and should be based on a national standard of practice. And that national standard of practice should be based on what has been proven to be effective and produce outcomes, not based on people's opinions, not based on people's beliefs, but based on evidence. And so for that to happen, that has to be a cry from the public. The public has to demand that this happen. People of color and their communities need to protest. This crisis impacts every child, regardless of age, disability, label, gender, socioeconomic status, ethnicity, or race, or type of school you attend. Every child in America is impacted by this. And so every person in America is impacted by this. So this needs to be a movement where people declare it is time for science-based instruction. It is time for our schools to evolve, and for the stronghold that certain lobbyists and associations have over teacher training programs and education more generally need to be put out to pasture. And so
this is the time. This is the time. I mean,
yes.
Blind Spots is coming out in the most perfect time. And you can get it on Amazon and Barnes and Noble, because, we're looking at science being moved from the thing we turn to for answers to be put on the back burner, and beliefs being put on the front burner. And I think, we are so many people are fighting against that. And I think, education really needs to be the next focus.
Yes.
To be able to do that. And
because this is the cause of everything. I mean, lack of education.
This is what our whole country's built on, is on educating our people. This is it. Nothing else can happen. We can't have a capitalist society. We can't be technologically advanced. We can't be able to be the best we can be as a country if our citizens aren't well educated.
Yep. We are going backwards. We are heading back to the Middle Ages and the Dark Ages, when beliefs guided medical practices. I mean, leeching and bloodletting and enemas and all the kinds of things that happen in medical practice, because they believed that the humors were out of balance and we have to balance the humors. And guess what? Most patients died, but physicians continued to do those practices. Why? Because ideology ran the show back then rather than science. So physicians kept practicing things that matched the beliefs of the culture, but it led to death. So guess what? There's been massive evolution in medical science. People are living through what used to be terminal cancers, and We can now make people who couldn't have babies have babies. And I mean, we can't, there's undeniable the types of advancement that have been made in medical science. Why? Because it is not an ideological institution. It is a pragmatic one.
Well,
And
science
so,
has to stop being the answer for only extremes. You know, I think, you know, what you said about, you know, that this is used with autism, it's like almost like our country has to hit rock bottom,
yes,
turn to science.
Yep.
And we really have to change that and let science come in and bring us to the top.
Yep.
That is so, your book is so important.
I don't know how much more rock bottom we can be in our educational system. I mean,
I think it's time.
I mean, we have been at rock bottom. We've never gotten off the cave floor, to be quite honest. We've been on the cave floor since it started, since compulsory education started. We've been on the floor of the cave. Like, I think it might be time for us to build a ladder and do something.
You know, our country and our world needs it. I mean, per usual, Dr. Kim, I'm blown away by what you have to say. It's so powerful. It's important for parents. It's important for educators and school administrators. And we really need to change so our children can soar. And your book really lights that path.
Thank you.
And I thank you so much for writing it and putting it out there and having us as parents get involved and speak up and start a movement where our children can learn based on science and that they can be the best that they can be. Thank you so much for joining me this morning on this very exciting book launch day.
Yay!
So glad that you were able to join us. Again, pick up your book on Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com. Your mind will be blown away and you'll really never see education the same way. And that's in all the best ways.
Yes.
So thank you so much, Dr. Kim. Thank you for everyone watching and being a part of it. Let's get that revolution started.
Yes.
So, stay safe. Have a great day and happy book launch day.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.